Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The wind came down from the mountains like a blade, dry, sharp, and relentless. Snow rolled across the open land in sheets, blinding anyone who dared to travel the back trails of the Arizona Territory. Elias Rowe urged his horse forward, one hand on the reins, the other pulling his coat tighter against the cold. He wasn't supposed to be out this far. Not anymore. He'd once owned a good herd and a family to go home to, but both were gone. His wife and son taken by fever 3 winters ago. The ranch left half abandoned ever since. He kept to himself now, fixing fences, hunting for meat, doing what was needed to get through each passing day. This ride wasn't for profit or work. It was survival, checking the far water lines before they froze solid and burst. That was all. But something caught his eye near the northern fence, an odd shape against the snow. At first, he thought it was a dead animal. Then he saw a hand. Elias stopped the horse and climbed down, boots sinking deep. The figure was half covered in ice crust, motionless except for a faint tremor of breath. It was a woman, thin, dressed in torn wool and a ragged shawl, her face pale and lips cracked. Her eyelids fluttered, barely conscious. He knelt beside her, brushing the snow from her face. "Ma'am." His voice came out rough from disuse. She didn't answer. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. A heartbeat, faint but there. He looked around. The land was empty for miles. Not a cabin, not a light. Bringing her back would slow him, risk losing the horse to the cold. But leaving her wasn't an option. His conscience wouldn't allow it, not again. He slipped his arms under her, lifting her easily. She was light, too light. He laid her across the saddle, tied her shawl to keep her from falling, and mounted up behind her. The mare protested under the extra weight, but Elias pushed her on. Snow battered his face, the wind cutting through his scarf. He kept his eyes on the faint trail ahead, knowing every turn, every landmark buried under white. The cabin was still a mile off. He could feel her body trembling against him, breath shallow. "Hold on," he muttered, though he knew she couldn't hear. By the time he reached the cabin, his hands were stiff from cold and his coat soaked through. He lifted her down, half carrying, half dragging her inside. The room was dark except for a dying ember in the hearth. He dropped his gloves, struck a match, and fed the fire until it caught again. He laid her on his bed, the only one in the cabin, and took in her face under the lamplight. Early 30s maybe, fine features but worn by hard travel. There was dirt under her fingernails, cuts on her palms, bruises on her wrists. Someone had either beaten her or bound her. Elias hesitated before touching her coat. She was soaked through. He exhaled hard, steadying his nerves. He'd lived alone long enough that even basic decency felt like crossing a line. But she'd die if he didn't. He removed her coat, then her wet boots, setting them near the fire. Her lips moved slightly. He leaned closer. "Please, don't send me back," she whispered, voice hoarse. He frowned. "Ain't sending you anywhere. You're safe now." She didn't answer. Her breathing slowed, and she went still again. Elias sat beside the bed, rubbing his hands together near the fire. The warmth returned slowly, crawling back into his fingers. He watched her chest rise and fall, shallow but steady. He wasn't sure what to do next. The last time he'd nursed anyone, it had ended with 2 graves behind the barn. He didn't want to open that wound again. But the sight of her lying there, frozen, helpless, barely hanging on, stirred something he thought was long gone: responsibility. He poured a cup of water, forced a few sips between her lips, then checked the fire again. The storm raged outside, hammering the roof like distant gunfire. There was no going out again tonight. Elias finally sat down on the edge of a chair by the bed. His back ached from the ride, and exhaustion pulled at him, but his eyes stayed on her. He didn't know her story yet, didn't care to, not tonight. For now, she was just a human being who needed help. And for the first time in years, Elias Rowe had something to protect again. By morning, the storm had calmed, but the world outside was buried in white. The first sound was the slow crack of wood in the hearth. Elias stirred, shoulders stiff, hands numb from where he had dozed in the chair beside the bed. The woman was still there, breathing evenly now, her skin no longer pale as death. He stood quietly, rubbing his neck, watching her face as the light from the window spilled across the room. He hadn't planned for company. Not this winter, not ever. The cabin was built for one man, not for visitors. Still, he moved quietly, checking the stove, slicing the last bit of salted pork into a pan. The smell filled the room slowly, mixing with the smoke from the fire. When she woke, her eyes darted around the room like someone expecting danger. For a moment, she looked ready to run. Elias stayed still. "You're safe," he said. "You passed out near my fence line. I brought you here." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She pushed herself up slowly, wrapping the blanket tight. "I thought I was dead," she said, voice hoarse. "You would have been," he replied. "Lucky I was out checking the water lines." She blinked, unsure how to answer. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. She looked around the cabin, wood walls, a table with one chair, a rifle above the door, boots by the fire. Simple, lived in, lonely. After a moment, she asked, "Where am I?" "Rose Place, few miles west of Dry Creek." Her expression shifted at the name. "They'll be looking for me," she whispered. Elias stopped, turning from the stove. "Who?" She hesitated. "Men from town. I was working at the mercantile. Someone stole from the register. They said it was me." Her voice trembled slightly. It wasn't. He studied her. He could tell she believed every word she said, but he'd seen enough men and women lie to survive. He didn't press her, just nodded once. "You're safe here for now," he said. "No one rides out this far in a storm." Her shoulders eased a little. She reached for the tin cup on the bedside table and took a slow drink of water. "What's your name?" "Elias Rowe." "Clara," she said after a moment. "Clara Hale." He nodded again, saying nothing more. For a few minutes, the only sound was the frying pan and the wind outside, distant but still strong. When breakfast was ready, he placed a plate on the table and gestured to it. She hesitated, unsure if she should move. He nodded again. "Eat. You'll need strength." She sat, still wrapped in the blanket, eating slowly. Her hands shook from weakness, but she didn't complain. He poured her coffee, black and strong, and sat across from her. The cabin felt smaller than ever. After a while, she spoke softly. "Why did you help me?" Elias looked up. "Couldn't leave you there." "That's simple," she asked, almost to herself. He didn't answer. He wasn't a man who explained himself, not after years of losing what he cared for. But her question sat in his mind longer than he expected. When she finished eating, she said, "I'll be gone once I can walk. You don't have to worry." He stood and put on his coat. Wasn't worried. He pulled open the door, letting in a slice of cold air. "If you're smart, you'll wait till the snow breaks." Then he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. For the first time in months, Elias found his thoughts refusing to quiet. As he shoveled snow from the barn entrance, he caught himself wondering what kind of life could drive a woman like her to run through a storm. She didn't look dangerous, just scared, desperate. He remembered the way she'd said, "Don't send me back," half conscious in the night. Those words had weight. Inside, Clara sat near the fire, staring at her torn coat drying by the hearth. The smell of smoke clung to everything, the walls, the blanket, even her hair. She felt like she didn't belong there. It was the first place in weeks that didn't feel hostile. She replayed the moment when he found her, his silent expression, his steady hands. She didn't know this man, but something about his quietness felt safe, like he'd seen worse things than she had. That afternoon, she gathered the courage to stand. Her legs trembled, but she managed to reach the window. The world outside was white and endless. No sign of the road, no sound but the wind. Escape was impossible for now. When Elias returned before dusk, his coat was crusted with snow. He hung it on the wall and placed fresh wood by the stove. Clara turned toward him. "It's getting worse again," she said quietly. He nodded. "Looks that way." Neither spoke after that. He fixed the fire. She watched the flames. They ate in silence later, two strangers bound by circumstance. And yet, something unspoken had begun to shift. Elias, who hadn't let another soul into his life for years, found himself listening for her breathing when the cabin went quiet. Clara, who had learned to trust no one, caught herself believing him when he said she was safe. Outside, the storm began again. Inside, for the first time, the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like shelter. The storm raged through the night, beating against the windows like it meant to test the cabin's strength. Elias barely slept. He lay awake in the chair near the fire, the wood creaking under the weight of the wind. Every now and then, he looked toward the bed where Clara slept, her breathing steady, her face calm for the first time since he found her. By dawn, the fire had burned low again. The chill crept back into the air, settling into the corners of the cabin. Elias got up quietly, stirred the embers, and added more wood. He wasn't used to anyone else's presence, especially not a woman in his home. It stirred old memories he'd buried deep, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. When Clara woke, the sound of the storm was still there, but distant, fading toward the mountains. Her hair clung to her face. Her cheeks were flushed with warmth. She sat up slowly, her eyes landing on Elias, who stood by the stove pouring coffee. "Morning," he said, his voice calm but distant. She nodded, rubbing her hands together. "Feels like the world froze over." It almost did. He handed her a cup of coffee, steaming hot. She accepted it carefully, her fingers trembling. For a long moment, they drank in silence. Outside, a faint light spread across the snow, the kind that never quite turned golden, only cold and flat. Clara glanced toward the window. "How far is the next town?" 2 days' ride. "Maybe 3 in this weather," Elias replied. She looked down at her hands. "They'll be looking for me there too." Elias said nothing, but he understood. He could see it in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed when the wind changed direction, as if she expected someone to appear. "I can't go back," she whispered finally. "Not after what they said. You said you didn't steal." "I didn't." She looked up sharply, as if daring him to doubt her. "I believe you," Elias said simply. His voice carried no hesitation, and that startled her more than suspicion would have. For a while, they said nothing. Clara set her cup down and stared at the fire. Her throat tightened as she spoke again. "They said I took $50 from a till. I'd worked there 6 months. The owner's son lost at gambling and blamed me. By the time I realized, they'd already come with ropes and talk of justice." She swallowed hard. "I ran before they could decide what kind." Elias's jaw tightened. He'd seen that kind of thing before. Town men quick to accuse the weak, quicker to wash their hands of the truth. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. Clara looked at him, uncertain whether he was judging her or not. "You sound like you've seen this before." He turned toward the window, his voice low. "I've seen worse." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Both carried stories that didn't need telling, not yet. Later that day, the snow eased. Elias went outside to check on the horses, and Clara followed, wrapped in a spare coat. The cold hit her immediately, but she wanted to see the world she'd nearly died in. The air smelled sharp, clean, untouched. The land stretched endlessly, the kind of emptiness that could crush a person or set them free. "Used to be more fences out here," Elias said, fixing a post. "Had a herd once. Sold off most after." He stopped mid-sentence, his hands tightening around the hammer. "After what?" she asked gently. He didn't look at her. "After my family passed." Clara lowered her eyes, her tone soft. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said after a pause. "It's life. Some folks just don't get second chances." Clara's breath fogged in the air. "Maybe this is yours," she said before realizing she'd spoken out loud. Elias didn't respond, but the words hung between them like something neither could take back. That evening, they shared a simple meal of beans and bread. Clara helped clean up afterward, insisting despite his protest. When she dropped a tin plate, the sound startled them both. She froze, waiting for anger. Elias only said, "It's fine," and picked it up. He could see it in her, how she flinched at small noises, how her eyes darted toward the door whenever the wind picked up. Whatever had happened in that town, it had left her expecting cruelty. Before turning in, Elias checked the fire once more. "The cold will come back strong tonight," he said. "You should stay near the heat." "There's only one bed," she said softly, glancing toward it. He nodded, unsure how to answer. "You take it. I'll stay by the fire." But when night fell and the temperature dropped, the fire struggled to keep up. Clara tried to sleep, but couldn't stop shaking. She turned toward Elias, who sat by the hearth, arms crossed, head bowed. "You'll freeze out there," she said quietly. "I've had worse," he muttered. She hesitated, then added, "We both nearly died last night. It's too cold to be proud." Elias looked at her for a long time, the firelight reflecting in his tired eyes. Finally, he stood. The floor creaked as he walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, careful to leave space between them. She pulled the blanket around them both, their shoulders barely touching. No words were exchanged. The cabin filled with the soft sound of wind, the faint crackle of the fire, and two hearts still uncertain of what to trust. As Clara drifted towards sleep, she realized she wasn't trembling anymore. Elias sat still, staring at the flames, wondering why helping her felt so heavy, and why he couldn't imagine turning her away anymore. Outside, the storm moved on. Inside, warmth slowly began to return, quiet, earned, and fragile. Morning came slowly, gray and still. The fire in the hearth had burned down to ash, and the cold had crept back into every corner of the small cabin. Elias opened his eyes first. For a moment, he didn't move. Clara was still beside him, her breathing even, her back turned toward the faint light pushing through the frost-covered window. He sat there quietly, unsure what he was supposed to feel. He hadn't shared a bed with anyone in years, not since the fever took his wife and child, and the weight of that realization pressed on him like something physical. He stood carefully, not wanting to wake her, and went to stir the fire. His hands were stiff, his movements slow. He added wood, blew on the coals, and watched the flames return. The smell of smoke filled the cabin again, familiar, grounding. He found himself listening for her breathing, and when he realized it, he looked away, irritated with himself. When Clara finally stirred, she blinked toward the light and the sound of the crackling fire. For a moment, confusion crossed her face, then memory returned. Her eyes softened. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. "Not much," Elias admitted. "You could have stayed in bed," she said, her voice gentle but uncertain. He shook his head. Habit. They both knew that wasn't the full truth. Elias didn't know how to rest around people anymore. Every sound, every movement reminded him of what he'd lost. He poured her coffee from the pot and handed it over without a word. She thanked him, her fingers brushing his briefly. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that settled naturally between two people who didn't need to talk to fill the space. Still, there were things unsaid, things both of them were beginning to think about. Clara looked around the cabin more carefully that morning. The place was neat but worn. A few pictures hung on the wall, faded sketches of a woman and a child, yellowed with time. On a shelf sat a small wooden horse, hand-carved and untouched by dust. She noticed the way Elias's eyes flicked toward it every now and then, but never stayed long. "You built this place yourself?" she asked softly. "Mostly," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "My boy helped me finish the roof. He was 12. His voice faltered at the end. Clara didn't look away. "What happened?" Elias kept his gaze on the fire. "Fever came through the valley. Took half the town. My wife, Sarah, went first. Then him. Didn't leave much worth talking about after that." The words came out flat, but Clara could hear the weight behind them, the kind that doesn't fade with time. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He gave a small nod. "Ain't your fault." They sat in silence again, both lost in thought. Clara's mind went to her own past, the town she'd worked in, the way people looked at her once she was accused. The fear of being seen as something she wasn't. She understood loss too, just not the same kind. By midday, the snow outside began to melt slightly. Elias pulled on his coat and boots. "Need to check the creek. See if it's still frozen solid. You stay inside, ground's slick." "I can help," she said. "You can barely stand without shaking," he replied. "I can still help," she insisted, a quiet determination in her tone. He gave her a long look, then relented. "All right, but stay close." They stepped outside together. The sky was pale, the air cold but bearable. The land stretched wide, blank and silent, broken only by the line of fence posts disappearing into the snow. Clara followed him to the edge of the creek. The ice was thick but cracking at the edges. Elias knelt down, tapping it with a stick. Still solid. Won't be for long. Clara watched him work. You've lived out here alone since then? He nodded. Town's not much for company. They talk too much. Out here, nobody asks questions. Maybe that's not always good, she said quietly. He looked up at her, meeting her eyes for a moment. She didn't look away. There was something in her expression, something honest, unafraid. He stood, brushing the snow from his gloves. You might be right, he said finally. When they returned to the cabin, Clara helped him hang her wet coat near the fire. Her hands moved slowly, methodically, the way people do when they're trying to keep busy. You could have left me out there, she said after a while. Would have been easier. I thought about it, he admitted, surprising even himself with the honesty. Didn't sit right. Why? He hesitated. Maybe because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it. Guess I owe that debt. Clara studied him for a moment. Then maybe we both do. That night, the sky cleared completely for the first time in days. Through the window, the stars looked sharp and close enough to touch. Elias sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. Clara sat by the fire, mending a tear in his glove. There was no need for talk. Every small action, the passing of a cup, the shared look when the fire popped, said more than words could. But one question hung quietly in the air, one that neither dared to ask yet. What happens when the snow melts? Clara thought about it as she finished sewing, her hands trembling slightly from fatigue. She wasn't sure if she wanted to leave anymore. The cabin, for all its silence and roughness, felt like the first safe place she'd known in years. And Elias, distant, quiet Elias, felt like a man who'd forgotten how to live, but hadn't forgotten how to care. Before turning in, she looked over at him. Thank you, she said softly. He didn't look up from the rifle. For what? For not asking questions. Elias glanced at her then, his eyes tired but kind. You'll tell what needs telling when you're ready. Outside, the wind had died. Inside, the air was warm. The small cabin that had once been a place of solitude had turned into something else entirely, a fragile kind of peace neither of them wanted to break. The next morning brought a rare calm. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a crust that cracked underfoot. The air was cold but clear, the kind that made every sound sharper. Elias was already outside, splitting wood when Clara stepped out of the cabin, wrapped in his old coat, her breath clouding in the air. She looked steadier now, stronger than the half-frozen woman he had pulled from the snow days ago. You shouldn't be out here long, he said without looking up. I can work, she replied. You've done enough alone. He paused, resting the axe head on the block. You don't owe me anything. I'm not doing it because I owe you, she said. I just need to do something. Elias studied her for a moment before nodding. There's a shed behind the barn. Could use sorting, tools, ropes, feed bags. Keeps your hands busy, if nothing else. She managed a faint smile. Sounds better than sitting still. They spent the morning working in silence, each keeping to their tasks. The rhythm of the ranch slowly came alive again. The thud of the axe, the creak of wood, the low snort of the horses inside the barn. For the first time in years, Elias felt something close to routine that wasn't marked by loneliness. At midday, they sat on the porch steps with mugs of hot coffee. The sun reflected off the snow, bright enough to hurt the eyes. Clara tucked her hair behind her ear and looked across the valley. It's beautiful, she said quietly. Cold kind of beautiful, Elias muttered. She smiled. Still counts. They sat quietly after that. Elias wasn't a man used to small talk, but her voice had a calmness to it that filled the silence without breaking it. He found himself wondering again who she had been before all this, before the accusation, before the fear. You said the store owner's son blamed you, he said finally. Did anyone stand up for you? Clara shook her head. People don't risk much for someone with no family name. I've been in that town less than a year. When trouble came, it was easier for them to believe the stranger did it. Elias nodded, jaw tightening. That sounds like Dry Creek, all right. Same folks that talk about justice by day and string people up by night. You know them? She asked. Used to. Sold cattle there. Haven't been back since my family passed. He hesitated, then added, "You were right. Maybe being alone too long isn't good for a man." Clara turned toward him. "Then maybe we both needed to end up here," she said softly. He looked at her, but didn't respond. Her words hit something deep, something he wasn't ready to name. As the days passed, a quiet order settled between them. Clara kept the cabin in shape, mending torn curtains, cooking simple meals, organizing the shelves. Elias worked outside from dawn till dusk, fixing fences and hauling supplies from a barn. They didn't speak much, but when they did, the words felt real. Each night, they shared dinner by the fire, their conversations inching closer to familiarity. Still, a shadow hung over the peace they were building. Clara often glanced toward the window at dusk, watching the road disappear into the distance. She didn't say it, but Elias knew what she was thinking. The men from town weren't done with her. One evening, after supper, Clara finally said aloud, "They'll come looking." Elias stopped setting the plates aside. "You sure? They'll say I stole from them. $50 isn't much to them, but it's pride they're after, not money. They'll come." He stared at the fire, jaw set. "Then they'll find this place hard to get through." She watched him quietly, unsure if his words were meant to comfort or warn. "You shouldn't risk yourself for me," she said. "If they find me here, they'll blame you too." Elias met her gaze. "I've lived through worse blame than theirs." The conversation ended there, but neither forgot it. The next morning, Elias began stacking more firewood near the door, checking the rifle by the window, moving with a silent precision that came from experience. Clara didn't ask, but she understood. He was preparing. That night, when the wind rose again, she couldn't sleep. She sat up, staring at the dim glow of the fire. Elias was still awake, sitting by the table with his old ledger open, running a finger down the faded list of supplies from years ago. "You used to have a big ranch, didn't you?" she asked quietly. He looked up, then nodded. "About 100 head. 3 ranch hands. It was good land. My boy used to name the calves." He smiled faintly, then closed the ledger. "Doesn't matter now. It's just ghosts and fences." Clara hesitated. Maybe not ghosts. Maybe just waiting for someone to bring it back to life. He studied her face for a moment, the flicker of firelight catching her eyes. There was no pity in her expression, just quiet conviction. Elias hadn't seen that in a long time. "You talk like someone who still believes things can be fixed," he said. She shrugged. "Things maybe not. People sometimes." Elias leaned back, considering that. "You really think people change?" "I think they remember what they used to be," she said softly. "And sometimes that's enough." The cabin fell quiet again. The wind eased outside. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. It felt different now, shared. As the fire dimmed, Clara lay back down, closing her eyes. Elias stayed awake a little longer, watching the snow drift past the window. He couldn't explain it, but something in him had shifted. The ranch didn't feel empty anymore. It felt lived in. He wasn't sure how long that feeling would last or what would come next. But for now, that was enough. The following days passed in a fragile peace. The snow softened, the air grew warmer, and for a brief while, life at the ranch felt almost ordinary. Clara swept the porch in the mornings, Elias worked the corral, and the two shared quiet meals in the evenings. There was a rhythm now, slow, grounded, unspoken, but under it all, both knew it couldn't last. The world outside the valley didn't forget people like them. One afternoon, Clara stood by the fence, watching the sun dip low over the white plain. Her hands were roughened by work again, but her body had grown steadier, her face healthier. Elias was repairing the barn roof nearby, his hammer echoing against the wood. It had been days since they last mentioned the men from town. Both avoided the subject, but both felt it closing in. When he climbed down from the roof, Elias found her standing still, looking toward the distant hills. "Something on your mind?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "You ever think about leaving this place?" "Not in a long time," he said. "Where would I go?" She turned to him. "Anywhere. Somewhere warmer. Maybe somewhere people don't know your name." He shook his head. "My name's all I got left." She looked away, her expression unreadable. "I guess I lost mine." Elias watched her for a moment, realizing how much fear still lived under her calm. You think they're still looking for you? I know they are, she said quietly. Men like that don't stop. They need someone to blame, and I was easy. Then they'll come here, Elias said. It wasn't a question. She didn't argue. You shouldn't have to deal with that. I've dealt with worse than a few angry men, he replied. And I ain't about to hand someone over just to make them happy. That night, Elias cleaned a rifle and laid it on the table by the door. He checked the window latches and brought the horses closer to the barn. Clara noticed but said nothing. She knew preparation when she saw it. He didn't say he was protecting her, but the care in his movements said it clearly. Later, as they sat by the fire, Clara asked, "When was the last time anyone came here?" "Couple of years," Elias said. "A trader passed through, looking for directions. Before that, just silence. Nobody rides this way without a reason." "Then maybe I brought trouble to the one place that didn't have any left," she said softly. Elias looked at her across the firelight. "You brought company. That's a kind of trouble I can live with." She smiled faintly but didn't answer. The fire crackled between them, and for a moment, the storm that once defined their meeting felt like a memory. The next morning, Elias saddled his horse. Clara stepped out, frowning. "Where are you going?" "Down the trail. Need to check the traps near the ridge. Won't be gone long." "You think they're close?" He hesitated, just making sure. She watched him ride out until he disappeared into the trees. The silence afterward was heavy. Inside, she tidied the cabin, fed the fire, then sat by the window. Every gust of wind made her flinch. Every shadow on the horizon made her heart race. She didn't want to admit it, but the thought of Elias not returning scared her more than the men from town. By dusk, the sky turned red and gold. Clara was standing by the stove when she heard the sound. Horses. Not one, but several. Her breath caught. She looked out the window and saw 3 riders making their way toward the cabin. She froze. The lead rider was a tall man in a dark coat, hat pulled low. The others followed, rifles strapped to their saddles. They stopped a few yards from a porch. One of them shouted, "We're looking for a woman. Name's Clara Hale. She stole from the Dry Creek Mercantile." Clara backed away from the window, her pulse hammering. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The back door led to open ground, no cover for miles. The riders waited, scanning the place. "We know she came this way," one of them called. "Old rancher like you can't hide her forever." Elias appeared then, riding in from the west. He slowed his horse, taking in the scene before speaking. "You're on private land," he said calmly. The tall man turned his horse toward him. "We're looking for a thief, not trouble." "Looks to me like you found both," Elias replied. The man smirked. "She's wanted in town. If you're hiding her, you're part of it." Elias dismounted, stepping between them and the cabin. "Ain't hiding anyone. But if I was, you'd have to get through me first." The standoff stretched long enough for the wind to still. One of the men reached for his rifle, but the tall man raised a hand to stop him. "We'll be back," he said. "Don't make us ride this way again." Elias didn't move until they turned their horses and disappeared down the ridge. When they were gone, he exhaled slowly and went inside. Clara stood by the door, shaking. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice trembling. "Now they'll come back." "They were going to anyway," Elias said, setting his hat down. "Next time we'll be ready." "I can't stay here," she said suddenly. "They'll burn this place down just to get to me." He looked at her, his voice steady. "Then they'll have to burn it with me in it." She stared at him, unsure how to respond. No one had ever stood up for her before, not once. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. Elias hesitated. "Because someone should have done it a long time ago. For you, for me, for anyone who got left behind." Clara turned away, her eyes wet but her expression firm. For the first time, she understood something about him that went beyond kindness. He wasn't just protecting her out of pity. He was fighting a piece of himself he'd let die years ago. That night, neither of them slept much. The sound of the wind against the roof returned, but now it carried something different: anticipation. Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while Elias sat near the window, watching the horizon for movement. He felt the weight of what was coming, but didn't regret a thing. Whatever this woman had brought into his quiet life, fear, danger, change, it was real. And that was something he hadn't felt in years. Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow and silent. Inside, the fire burned steady, a defiant glow in the darkness. The night after the riders came was the longest either of them could remember. The firelight flickered across the cabin walls, throwing restless shadows that made Clara's nerves tighten with every sound. Elias sat at the table, rifle across his lap, his expression fixed, calm but watchful. Outside, the wind dragged across the land in uneven gusts, making the barn door creak like a warning. Clara paced near the window. "They'll be back," she whispered. "You know they will." Elias didn't look up. "I know. And if they bring more men?" He raised his eyes, then, steady and cold. "Then I'll make sure they don't ride home the same way they came." She stared at him, realizing he meant it. "You'll kill them?" "If that's what it takes," he said, voice low. "There's not much law out here, Clara. Men like that think they can do what they want. But this land, this house, it's mine. I don't plan to let them take either." Clara turned away, pressing her hands together to stop their trembling. She wanted to tell him to leave her, to save himself from the trouble she'd brought. But every time she opened her mouth, the words stuck. He had already decided. By dawn, the world was quiet again. Elias went out to check the perimeter. Clara watched from the doorway, arms crossed against the cold. He moved methodically, checking the fence line, the trail, the barn. When he came back in, his boots were wet with frost. "They didn't come," she said. "Not yet," he replied. "They will." Clara hesitated, then asked the question that had been building in her since the night before. "Why are you really doing this, Elias? You could have turned me in and been done with it." He took off his coat, hung it by the fire, and sat down before answering. "Because I've spent too many years doing nothing while bad things happened. When you lose people the way I did, you stop fighting. You tell yourself it's not your problem anymore. But when I found you in that snow, I remembered someone once dragged me out of a blizzard too. Saved my life. Never even told me his name. Maybe this is me paying that back." Claire sat across from him, eyes fixed on the floor. "And if it costs you your life?" He looked at her then, unflinching. "Then I'll go down with something worth standing for." That silenced her. For a moment, the air between them felt heavier than the storm outside. She wanted to speak, but nothing she could say would carry enough meaning. Later that day, they worked in silence. Elias chopping more wood, Clara packing supplies into a crate. She kept glancing toward the horizon, waiting for the first sign of dust, the glint of movement. By late afternoon, the sky turned gray again, heavy with another snow front. Inside, Elias cleaned his rifle. Clara sat near the fire, sewing a tear in his shirt. Her hands moved slowly, careful and deliberate. "You said someone saved you before," she said quietly. "Who was it?" He thought for a long moment. "A scout years ago. I got caught in a storm near the border. My horse broke its leg, and I was too stubborn to head back. Woke up half buried in snow. He found me, got me to a shelter, and left before dawn. Didn't even tell me his name. I never saw him again. Did you ever try to find him?" Elias shook his head. "Didn't need to. Some debts you just carry." That answer lingered with her. For the first time, Clara saw him not just as a quiet man with a broken past, but as someone who had spent his life paying for things that weren't his fault. That evening, as they sat down to eat, the dogs in the distance began barking. Elias froze, fork halfway to his mouth. Then came the sound, horses again, this time closer. Clara's heart sank. She stood slowly. "It's them." Elias rose, calm and deliberate. "Stay inside. If I don't come back." "Don't," she cut in sharply. "Don't say that." He met her eyes for a long moment. "Then stay low. And don't open that door for anyone but me." He stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind him. The snow had begun again, falling in thick flakes that blurred the horizon. 3 riders came into view from the ridge. Same men, this time with another 2 behind them. The leader dismounted, a rifle in his hand. Elias stood firm, the shotgun resting easily in his grip. "I told you once," he said evenly, "this is private land." The man sneered. "You hiding her still?" Elias didn't answer. His silence was enough. "Then you're part of it," the man said. "We'll take her, and we'll take whatever else we damn please." Elias raised the shotgun slightly. You'll try. The moment stretched thin as wire. Then the man reached for his revolver, and Elias fired first. The blast shattered the silence, echoing across the plain. One man fell from his horse, snow kicking up around him. The others scattered, shouting, returning fire. Bullets cracked through the air, splintering the fence posts. Clara flinched at the sound inside the cabin. She crouched by the window, trembling, watching through the small gap in the curtain. Elias moved like he'd done this before, calm, efficient. He fired once more, reloading fast, driving the men back. When the smoke cleared, 2 horses bolted into the trees. The remaining men dragged their wounded partner up and retreated down the ridge. Elias lowered the shotgun, but didn't move until they were gone. Only then did he turn back toward the cabin. Clara met him at the door. Her eyes were wide, frightened, not of him, but of what she had seen him capable of. "You could have died," she said. He leaned the shotgun against the wall, his breath heavy. "So could you." She stepped closer. "They'll tell others." "I know," he said, "but now they know I won't run." She reached out, resting a hand on his arm. It was the first time she'd touched him without hesitation. You didn't have to do that." He looked at her hand, then at her face. "Yes, I did." They stood there in silence, the firelight flickering across their faces. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and smoke, but for the first time, Clara felt something stronger than fear, safety. Not because the danger was gone, but because someone had chosen to face it with her. Later that night, as Elias sat by the fire, Clara spoke softly. "You said once this place wasn't worth much anymore. You were wrong." He looked up, tired but faintly smiling. "Maybe it wasn't until you showed up." Neither said anything after that. Outside, the snow fell steady and quiet again, covering the signs of the fight. Inside, for the first time since that long winter began, the silence felt peaceful. The following morning dawned pale and silent. The snow that had fallen overnight covered everything. The broken fence posts, the tracks of the riders, even the blood that had stained the ground. To anyone passing through, it would look as if nothing had happened at all. But inside the cabin, the air carried a weight that couldn't be buried so easily. Elias stood by the window, watching the faint steam rise from the horse's breath in the corral. His coat was still hanging by the door, dusted with gunpowder. Clara sat by the fire, stitching a small tear in the sleeve of his shirt. She hadn't said much since the night before, but her hands moved with quiet focus, her expression unreadable. Finally, she broke the silence. "You've done this before." Elias turned slightly. "Done what?" "Fought men like that. The way you moved, it wasn't the first time." He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the horizon, where the sky met the hills. "A long time ago," he said finally, "before I had the ranch. Before the fever took everything." "What were you then?" "A deputy. For a short while." His tone was flat, as if he was reciting something he'd already put behind him. "Town down south. Too many drifters, too much whiskey, too little sense. I quit after the job, started asking for more bullets than judgment." Clara looked down at her sewing, nodding slowly. "So that's why you don't trust the law." Elias gave a faint, humorless smile. "Law's just men with power. And men with power don't always want truth." "That's what they were like in Dry Creek," she said. "They didn't care about what was right, just who had friends to back them." Their eyes met across the cabin, 2 people who had both been burned by the same world in different ways. Neither said more, but the silence that followed wasn't cold anymore. It carried an understanding. As the day passed, the snow melted slightly, and the air grew heavy with moisture. Elias worked outside, repairing the barn door, while Clara tended to the fire and sorted supplies. When he came back in near noon, she was preparing a simple stew. The smell of it filled the small room, blending with the scent of wood smoke. She looked up as he entered. "You think he'll come back?" Elias shrugged. "Not soon. I gave them a story they'll think twice about repeating. But word travels. Someone will talk. So what happens then?" "Then we see it through," he said simply. Clara stirred the pot, her jaw tight. "You keep saying we," she said after a moment. "You don't have to include me in that." "I already did," he replied, "when I brought you in from the snow." She turned to him, trying to speak, but her throat tightened. She looked back at the fire instead. You could have left me. You should have. Elias's voice softened. If I had, I'd be no better than the men you ran from. That night, after supper, Clara sat near the hearth while Elias mended his saddle strap. The storm outside had passed, but a restless wind still swept through the valley. She watched him work in silence for a long time before speaking again. Elias, what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night? He paused, setting the strap aside. You'd be gone, he said plainly, and I'd still be sitting here waiting for nothing. Clara blinked, surprised by the quiet honesty in his words. You don't seem like a man who waits for anything. Used to be, he said. After my family, I told myself I was done caring. But I was just waiting for the world to stop turning. It never did. Clara looked into the fire. Maybe it started again when you found me. Elias didn't respond, but she saw something change in his expression, a flicker of thought, a hesitation, as if her words had reached somewhere he hadn't let anyone touch in years. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the roof under the wind. She sat up and looked around. The shelves, the rifle on the wall, the faint glimmer of moonlight on the floorboards. For the first time, this place didn't feel like a hiding spot. It felt like home. She noticed Elias was still awake, sitting in his chair near the window. You're not sleeping, she said softly. Old habit, he replied. Always easier to stay awake than to dream. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. You don't have to keep watch anymore. They're gone. Maybe, he said, but danger has a way of finding quiet places. She studied his face in the dim light. Tired, scarred, weathered by years of wind and grief, but steady. The kind of steadiness that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since she was a child. Elias, she said after a pause, what if you're wrong? What if they don't come back? What then? He leaned back in the chair, thinking. Then we fix the roof. Feed the horses. Plant something come spring. The simplicity of it made her smile. That sounds good. He nodded once. Good's enough for me. They sat in silence for a while longer. The fire burned low, throwing a warm orange glow across the room. Clara's eyes grew heavy, and before long, she drifted to sleep. Elias remained where he was, listening to the faint sound of her breathing. He looked around the cabin, the same cabin that once felt like a tomb, and realized it no longer felt empty. Something had changed, something small but unmistakable. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for the end of winter. He leaned forward, adding another log to the fire, and whispered quietly to himself, maybe this time I can stay. Outside, the snow softened under the moonlight, and the wind faded into stillness. The days that followed were quiet, but the kind of quiet that never truly settles. The snow began to melt, uncovering the ground beneath. The old fence posts, the brittle grass, and the faint signs of what had been a gunfight only days earlier. The world was changing again, slowly waking from its long winter. Clara stood on the porch one morning, the wind brushing against her hair. The air had a different smell now, less ice, more earth. The horses grazed near the corral, and she could hear Elias chopping wood somewhere behind the barn. It had become a sound she had learned to depend on, steady, measured, certain. But inside, she still carried unease. The men might have been gone, but she knew how gossip worked in small towns. Someone always wanted to be a hero, and someone always wanted to chase a story. Dry Creek wasn't far enough to forget her. Elias came up the path carrying a bundle of firewood. He set it down beside the door and nodded toward her. You're up early. Couldn't sleep, she said. It's too quiet. He smiled faintly. You'll get used to it. I don't think I ever will. She looked out at the horizon, her eyes narrowing. You think they'll come again? Elias shook his head. No, not the same ones. Word'll spread. Old man, Roe won't be worth the trouble. He paused, then added quietly, but word also travels about you. Some will believe your story. Some won't. She turned to him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Then what happens to me? Elias hesitated before answering. That depends what you want to happen. That question lingered in her mind long after he walked away. For the first time since she'd arrived, the decision was hers. She wasn't running anymore. but she didn't know what staying meant either. That evening, after the chores were done, she sat near the fire while Elias cleaned his rifle in silence. She watched him for a while before speaking. "If they came back tomorrow," she said, "would you still fight?" He looked up. "If I had to, even if it meant losing everything." He wiped the barrel clean and set the rifle aside. "Everything I ever had worth losing is already gone." She frowned. "That's not true anymore." Elias stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then quietly, "Maybe not." Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the old wood. The sound made Clara shiver. She leaned closer to the fire, her voice soft. "Elias, what if we left? Went somewhere else? Somewhere no one knows us?" He didn't answer right away. He poured coffee, sat down, and stared into the cup. "I've thought about it," he admitted, "but running never changes much. The world's the same everywhere. Men with guns, people with fear, the same rules for who gets blamed." She met his eyes. "Then what do we do?" "We live," he said simply. "Right here as long as we can." It wasn't the kind of promise she expected. It was better, realistic, grounded, human. The following morning, they rode out together to check the far end of the property. The snow had melted enough to reveal the dirt trail winding through the hills. Clara rode one of the older horses, her posture uncertain at first, but steadying with each mile. Elias rode beside her, silent as always but watchful. They stopped at the creek where he'd first found her buried in the snow. The ice had broken apart now, running fast and clear through the stones. Clara dismounted and crouched by the water. "I barely remember that night," she said. "Just cold, and then nothing. And then you." Elias looked at the water too. "You were almost gone when I found you. I don't know what made me ride that way. I wasn't planning to." She smiled faintly. "Maybe you did." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe you were just too stubborn to quit breathing." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "That sounds more like it." For a moment, they stood there in easy silence, listening to the rush of the water. The fear that had haunted her face since the night she arrived had softened into something calmer. Acceptance, perhaps even belonging. When they returned to the cabin that afternoon, Elias noticed the sky beginning to change. The clouds were thin, streaked with gold. He hadn't seen light like that in years. Clara stepped onto the porch beside him, wiping her hands on her skirt. "It feels different today," she said. He nodded. "It is." They stood there for a long time, saying nothing, just watching the last snow melt off the fence line. There was a stillness between them that felt earned, not forced, not uncertain, but solid. That night, Clara cooked stew while Elias fixed one of the window shutters. The air inside the cabin smelled of smoke and pine resin. When they sat down to eat, she said quietly, "Elias, when you found me, you didn't know who I was. You didn't ask. Why?" He thought for a moment. "Didn't matter. You were half dead. Didn't need a story to help someone." She nodded. "Then maybe that's what makes you different from them." He looked up from his plate. "Different how?" "You don't save people for a reason. You just do it because it's right." Elias gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "Maybe. Or maybe I was saving myself too." Clara tilted her head. "From what?" He hesitated, then answered, "From being done with people." The words hung there, heavier than they sounded. Clara smiled faintly and said, "Then I guess we saved each other." For a long time, neither spoke again. The fire burned low, and the sound of the wind outside was soft and distant. There was no fear left in the room, only warmth and quiet understanding. When Elias finally rose to check the door, Clara looked after him and said, almost to herself, "I think I'm home now." He turned, meeting her eyes. "You are." The light from the hearth caught his face just enough to show the trace of a tired smile, one that had been gone for years. The thought came early that year. The snow that had buried the valley for months finally melted into streams that carved their way through the hard soil. The land, once white and silent, began to breathe again. Muddy paths, green shoots, the sound of running water replacing the moan of winter wind. The ranch was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Elias stood by the porch one morning, coffee steaming in his hand, watching Clara scatter seed along the fence line. She moved with a quiet determination that reminded him of someone who had decided to stay, not out of desperation, but by choice. Her hair, now lighter from the sun, whipped gently in the breeze. She caught him watching her and smiled, that small, steady smile that had become part of his days. "You said this ground was too dead to grow anything," she called out. He took a sip, shrugging. "Maybe I was wrong. You ever admit that before?" "Once or twice," he said. "Didn't end well." She laughed, shaking her head, and went back to her work. Inside the cabin, things are different too. The old photographs were still there, but now they were joined by new ones Clara had found in a chest, blank frames she'd cleaned and hung. She placed one near the window, facing the sunrise, saying the cabin should hold some light again. The food shelves were stocked better now, the tools organized, the air less stale. Elias still rose before dawn, but now he came back to a warm meal instead of silence. It wasn't that they'd spoken about staying together. They didn't need to. Some things didn't need words. One afternoon, while Elias repaired the wagon axle, a rider appeared on the trail. Claire saw him first. Her heart jumped, but this one wasn't like the others. He wore no gun belt, no hardened look of vengeance. He stopped by the gate, removed his hat, and called out, "Mr. Rowe?" Elias approached slowly. "That depends who's asking. Name's Carter, sheriff out of Dry Creek." The man's voice was even calm. "I heard there was trouble out here a few weeks back. Some men rode home bleeding and talking about a gunfight." Elias didn't move his hand from the rifle leaning against the post. "They came here looking for a woman they had no right to hunt." Carter nodded. "That's what I heard. One of them confessed before he died. Turns out the mercantile's books were short because the owner's son was gambling. Your friend there, Clara Hale, she's cleared." Clara stepped forward slowly, her face pale. "You're certain?" The sheriff met her eyes. "Certain. Town's got bigger problems than chasing ghosts. You're free to go where you please." For a long moment, Clara didn't speak. The words didn't seem real. She'd lived so long under suspicion that freedom felt foreign. Elias glanced at her, his voice quiet. "You hear that? You're free." She nodded, but her eyes didn't move from him. "I don't know where I'd go," she said softly. Carter tipped his hat. "Then I'll let you two decide that. Just thought you should know." He turned his horse and rode off down the trail, leaving only dust and the fading sound of hooves behind. Claire stood there for a while, watching him go. The wind tugged at her coat, but she didn't move. Elias walked up beside her. "So," he said after a while, "what now?" She looked at him. "You don't want me to leave?" He didn't answer right away. His hand rested on the porch railing, fingers tracing the old grooves in the wood. "This place got quiet again after my family died. Thought it was better that way. But it wasn't living, it was just waiting. You brought life back here, Clara. You can stay if you want to." Her voice trembled slightly. "And if I do," he met her eyes, "then I'll make sure you never have to run again." The simplicity of it, the certainty in his tone, broke something loose inside her. She took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I already decided." Elias nodded once, a slow exhale escaping him, as if the years of guilt, solitude, and silence had finally eased their grip. That evening, the two of them sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The horses grazed nearby, the sound of the creek soft in the distance. For the first time in a long time, Elias felt peace, not the kind that comes from escape, but from staying. Clara leaned against the railing, her gaze calm. "Do you ever think your wife and boy would have liked me?" she asked suddenly. Elias was quiet for a moment before answering. "They'd have liked that you made me talk again." Clara smiled faintly. "You don't talk much." "Don't need to anymore," he said. As the last light faded, she rested her hand on his arm, and he didn't pull away. They stayed that way, side by side, the world quiet around them. The sky turned dark, and the first stars appeared above the valley. The cabin behind them glowed with the steady light of the fire, no longer a place of loss, but of endurance. Elias finally spoke, his voice low, steady. "Guess we made it through the winter." Clara nodded. "Maybe it wasn't the winter we needed to survive." He looked at her then, a hint of warmth in his tired eyes. "No," he said, "maybe not." The wind softened, carrying the scent of earth and spring grass. Inside, the fire burned bright and constant, the sound of it steady like breathing. Two people, once lost, now found. Not by chance, but by the simple act of staying when it mattered most. The ranch would see another season. The land would grow again. And for Elias Rowe and Clara Hale, the cold had finally ended for good.